The story you think you know about Alexander Fleming is usually summed up in 3 words. Happy accident.
Right.
You know, a forgotten petri dish, a stray mold spore, and then boom, the entire modern age of medicine just begins.
It is the most seductive kind of story, isn't it? Because it suggests that, genius is just luck. And that's deeply comforting.
Yeah, it makes it seem easy.
But if we just reduce Fleming's life to that one single accidental moment, we miss. We miss everything. We miss the decades of rigorous, often ignored critical thinking.
Right.
That thinking is what made him the only person in the world ready to recognize what that mold actually meant.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We are talking about the man whose work led to what a lot of historians call the single greatest victory ever achieved over disease in human history.
It's hard to argue with that.
But if you only focus on that 1928 discovery, you're obscuring this incredible intellectual journey and really 2 earlier vital contributions he made.
He didn't just stumble upon penicillin, he was actively hunting for something like it. And he was doing that based on lessons he learned in the trenches.
So our deep dive today is all about giving you that full, complex context of the antibiotic revolution.
We're going to move way past the simplified happy accident myth. And we're using comprehensive sources that detail his entire career, from his humble Scottish origins all the way to his knighthood and the 1945 Nobel Prize.
Which he shared, of course, with Howard Florey and Ernst Chain.
The chemists, yes.
So the mission for you, the listener, is to walk away with a shortcut to the full, nuanced story. We all know the end result. Penicillin saved millions of lives. But to really appreciate his genius, you have to look back.
You have to look at 2 other major pivotal observations. One involved critiquing established medical practice during a world war, and the other, the discovery of a different antimicrobial agent called lysozyme.
These really paved the way for everything that followed. Okay, so let's unpack this.
To really understand Fleming's unique approach to bacteriology, you have to appreciate his background.
He wasn't some product of the privileged London academic system.
No, not at all. He was born in 1881 on Lockfield Farm near Darvel in Scotland. It was a rural background, and it gave him this very practical, hands-on approach to solving problems.
And he started really far from medicine. After his initial schooling, he moved to London, went to the Royal Polytechnic Institution, and he even spent 4 years working in a shipping office.
Which sounds like the exact opposite of a research lab.
It really does. It wasn't until his older brother Tom, who was a physician, sort of pushed him into medicine after Alexander inherited a small sum from an uncle in 1903. That's when his path really changed.
That inheritance was the key. It's what allowed him to enroll at St. Mary's Hospital Medical School in Paddington. And he turned out to be a brilliant, if maybe an unconventional student.
He qualified with an MBBS degree with distinction in 1906. But the reason he stayed at St. Mary's, the reason he got into research in the first place, it's one of those wonderful, bizarre twists of history.
It all comes down to the Rifle Club.
The Rifle Club.
Right.
Yeah, Fleming was a very keen marksman. He was a private in the London Scottish Regiment of the Volunteer Force.
A very valuable member of the medical school's rifle team, and the club captain was desperate to keep him on the team at St. Mary's so they wouldn't lose his sharpshooting skills.
So the captain just suggests, hey, why don't you join the research department?
Hmm.
It was led by Sir Almroth Wright, who was a pioneer in vaccine therapy.
It's almost comical when you think about it. I mean, the fate of modern medicine hinged in part on keeping a good shot on the rifle team.
It's incredible. And he ended up thriving there. He got a BSc degree with a gold medal in bacteriology in 1908 and became Wright's assistant bacteriologist.
And this gave him a lab. It gave him a place where he could finally pursue his own curiosity.
And that curiosity and that scientific independence, it was really forged in fire, World War I.
He was commissioned as a lieutenant and served the entire war in the Royal Army Medical Corps. He spent his time at the military hospital at Boulogne-sur-Mer, which was right there near the Western Front.
This exposure to the sheer brutality of war wounds, I mean, these deep, ragged tears contaminated with soil, bits of clothing, shrapnel.
It was the definitive catalyst for his critical thinking. He and his colleagues were seeing these horrific rates of sepsis and death, even when the soldiers were being treated.
And that's what led to his first major piece of critical, you could even say, anti-establishment science.
Yes. His realization that the prevailing treatment, dousing these wounds in strong antiseptics, was actually doing more harm than good.
The common wisdom back then was just kill all the germs, save the patient. They were using things like carbolic acid, boric acid, hypochlorite.
All very harsh chemicals. Fleming's 1917 paper in The Lancet wasn't just his opinion. It was a systematic, quantified scientific takedown of that whole practice.
So what did he do? What was the experiment?
What he did was ingenious and very practical. He basically demonstrated that in these deep, complex wounds from trench warfare, the antiseptic solutions simply couldn't get deep enough.
All right.
They couldn't penetrate the tissue to reach the bacteria that were hiding deep inside, especially the anaerobic bacteria, the ones that thrive without oxygen.
So the surface bacteria might die, but the really deadly pathogens deeper in the wound were effectively untouched. They are protected by the body's own tissue.
Exactly. But here's the really insidious part that Fleming proved.
Okay.
The antiseptic solutions, because they're just indiscriminate protoplasmic poisons, they did easily penetrate and destroy the body's own critical defensive mechanisms.
You're talking about the leukocytes, the white blood cells. Can you just elaborate on why destroying those was so catastrophic?
Absolutely. Leukocytes are the body's frontline soldiers. They use a process called phagocytosis. They literally engulf and destroy pathogens.
Oh, they eat them.
Fleming showed that the common antiseptics, like carbolic acid, were incredibly effective at destroying these leukocytes. They were just, poisons. A diluted antiseptic strong enough to kill surface bacteria was often more than strong enough to destroy the patient's own biological defenses, especially deep in the wound.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, the antiseptics were killing the only beneficial agents the body was producing, while at the same time failing to reach the dangerous anaerobic pathogens that were causing the worst sepsis. He was essentially saying, you are killing the immune system without killing the enemy.
That is the perfect way to put it, and he quantified this. He showed that the ratio of bacteria killed by the body's defenses compared to the damage done by the antiseptic meant the patient was just worse off.
So what was his solution?
He concluded that irrigating with a simple saline solution, or even just warm water, which didn't interfere with the body's natural defenses, was often better than using these chemical poisons.
That's a genuinely revolutionary finding. I mean, that should have changed battlefield medicine overnight.
It should have. And here's the deep irony, which kind of foreshadows the rest of his career. Despite strong support from his mentor, Sir Almroth Wright, most army physicians just kept using the antiseptics.
Why? Just institutional inertia.
Institutional inertia is powerful. They'd been trained to use them, and to stop felt like they were just giving up. They didn't trust the findings of this relatively junior scientist who was arguing that doing less was better than the established toxic treatment.
So this set a pattern for him. Discover something profoundly true, publish it rigorously, and then watch the medical establishment mostly ignore it.
Yes, because it challenged the prevailing way of thinking.
He walked away from World War I with this fundamental belief that external chemical warfare against bacteria often failed, and the real secret had to be finding agents that were selectively toxic.
Potent enough to kill the germ, but gentle enough to leave the body's cells and its natural defenses unharmed.
And that philosophical pivot, forged in the trauma of the Western Front, that leads us directly into his next big discovery.
So after returning to St. Mary's in 1918, Fleming was relentless. He was hunting for these naturally occurring, non-toxic antibacterial substances. He just knew the external poisons were a dead end. The solution had to be biological.
And this brings us to the famous details about his lab. The sources, they all mention his productive untidiness.
A key environmental factor, yes.
His colleague V.D. Allison even noted that if Fleming had been as tidy as he thought I was, he would not have made his two great discoveries.
His chaotic benches allowed for open plates, for dust, for unexpected contamination, which in his case was really the engine of discovery.
That lack of tidiness led directly to the first great serendipity of his post-war career in late 1921.
The discovery of lysozyme. Fleming was handling some agar plates that were contaminated with bacteria from the air, which was a constant problem in London labs back then.
And then he got a cold. He contracted acute cordeza. And while he was handling one of these contaminated plates, he deliberately added a bit of his own nasal mucus to the culture.
And that intentional action is so key. It shows he was already actively looking for antibacterial properties in bodily fluids. This wasn't an accident.
He noted it right in his lab notebook on November 21st, 1921, linking the sample to himself. Staphylococcus from AF's nose.
And the observation he made was quick and dramatic. It must have reminded him of his work on antiseptics, but in reverse.
He saw a clear, transparent circle, about a centimeter across, all around the area where the mucus had touched the agar.
Inside that circle, the bacteria were saturalized, they were destroyed. And beyond that zone, you just had normal, opaque bacterial growth.
He realized right away he'd found an enzyme, something that was breaking down the bacteria.
Yes, and to verify it, he needed to test other biological secretions. And this is where that famous and, frankly, kind of absurd anecdote comes from.
He confirmed that saliva and tears also contained the substance, but tears were easier to get in bulk.
Which led to his campaign of using his coworkers and the lab attendants as, let's say, involuntary tear donors.
Imagine that scene. Allison recalls that for weeks, they were pressing colleagues into service. And since you can't just cry on demand,
they had to get creative. The source says, many were the lemons we used after the failure of onions to produce a flow of tears.
that is just fantastic. I love the image of this world-changing discovery requiring a team of scientists crying over beakers, smelling onions, or having lemon juice squeezed near their eyes.
And the detail that the lab attendants were paid 3 pence for each contribution just brings the whole scene to life.
It really does. It elevates it from just a dry scientific fact to a story about human curiosity, motivated by a small wage.
Exactly. And this persistent testing proved the agent was widely distributed in all sorts of human fluids, sputum, blood, even in egg whites. It was a component of our innate immunity.
So by 1922, he names the substance lysozyme. He publishes his findings. He even names the bacteria he used as his litmus test.
Micrococcus lysodeicticus, which means lysis indicator.
Lysozyme was fundamentally the world's first antimicrobial protein ever discovered. So what's the mechanism? How does it work?
So the enzyme breaks down the peptidoglycan layer. That's the mesh-like substance that forms the bacterial cell wall, especially in what we call gram-positive bacteria. This causes the cell to just burst.
This should have been heralded as a massive immunological breakthrough. But this is where history repeats itself.
You're right. Just like the World War I findings, the discovery of lysozyme was met with a scientific shoulder shrug.
Why?
Because of its immediate therapeutic failure. Lysozyme, while it was potent, was only effective against relatively harmless bacteria, like that micrococcus itself, or small counts of other environmental germs. It didn't effectively kill the major deep-seated pathogens like virulent staphylococci or streptococci that cause the most fatal diseases.
So he'd found a great antibacterial agent, but it was fighting the equivalent of, scientific skirmishes, not the actual war.
That is a perfect way to phrase it. V.D. Alson confirmed the cold reception when Fleming presented the paper. He recalled, no questions asked and no discussion.
A clear sign the medical community just thought it was irrelevant because it couldn't cure pneumonia right away.
Right, so he discovers this fundamental mechanism of innate immunity, a precursor to all future antibiotics, and he's completely ignored.
But for Fleming, this setback didn't stop him. It just solidified his belief that highly selective, non-toxic natural agents did exist. He just had to find one with a broader range of activity. So Fleming is back in his lab. He's now professor of bacteriology at the University of London, and he's still hunting for these antibacterial substances. He's guided by the failures of the war and the limitations of lysozyme. He's looking for that gentle, natural killer.
The year is 1928. He's doing research on the variation of Staphylococcus aureus strains. This was a follow-up to some work by Joseph Warwick Bigger.
And what was he trying to understand?
He wanted to see how these very common, very dangerous bacteria change their physical and biological properties.
And then comes the legendary moment. September 3rd, 1928. Fleming gets back to St. Mary's after a summer holiday in Suffolk.
He walks into his famously untidy lab and finds this stack of culture plates he had just left inoculated on a bench.
And on one of those plates, he noticed the predictable thing, contamination. But this contamination was a fungus, a mold.
It had clearly floated in through an open window from the street below. He later realized it actually came from the lab of a colleague, Charles J. Latouche, who was working directly downstairs.
But the core observation, which was informed by that lysozyme discovery 7 years earlier, was the difference between this and just any old contamination.
That's the whole point. This is why it wasn't just luck. Any other scientist would have just tossed the plate. But Fleming, he immediately saw that the colonies of Staphylococci surrounding the fungus were destroyed.
They were lysos, just like his micrococcus had been by lysozyme.
And his now famous, almost comically subdued reaction was just, that's funny.
He showed it to his former assistant, Merlin Price, who recognized the pattern immediately and said, that's how you discovered lysozyme.
It was a confirmation that his power of observation, honed by all his earlier work, was what mattered, not the mold spore itself.
So he grows the mold in a pure culture. He sees that the culture broth has this powerful antibacterial substance that was incredibly gentle on human cells.
And the mold was identified as Penicillium rubens, although it took botanists decades to finally settle on that name.
He initially just called the active ingredient mold juice, or the inhibitor. It wasn't until March 7, 1929, that he formally published his findings and gave it the name penicillin.
The next crucial step was figuring out its specificity, and this is where the real breakthrough was. Penicillin's range of action was perfect.
What did it affect?
He found it affected major gram-positive pathogens, Staphylococcus, Streptococcus, which causes scarlet fever, pneumococci for pneumonia, meningococci for meningitis, and the bacteria that causes diphtheria.
We should probably pause there and clarify that distinction. When he's talking about gram-positive versus gram-negative, what does that actually mean for how the drug works?
It's a crucial technical point. But to simplify, bacteria are classified based on the structure of their cell walls, which affects how they react to something called the gram stain.
Okay.
Gram-positive bacteria have a very thick layer of that peptidoglycan, that mesh-like structure we mentioned earlier. And penicillin is a beta-lactam antibiotic. Its whole mechanism is to specifically stop the synthesis of that peptidoglycan layer.
So it stops the bacteria from building a stable cell wall. It's a structural attack.
Exactly. It selectively targets that vulnerable, thick wall of the gram-positive strains.
And gram-negative.
Gram-negative bacteria have a much thinner peptidoglycan layer, and it's often protected by an outer lipid membrane. That protective barrier makes them much less susceptible to penicillin.
Which is why he noted that penicillin did not affect gram-negative bacteria, like the ones that cause typhoid or paratyphoid fever.
Deeply ironic, because those were the exact diseases he was trying to cure at the time, yet he had just stumbled upon a weapon against most of the other major historical killers.
And there was one interesting exception, wasn't there?
A fascinating one, he noted. Neisseria gonorrhoeae, the bacteria that causes gonorrhea. It is gram-negative, but for structural reasons, its outer membrane is uniquely permeable to penicillin.
So this profile, highly effective against major diseases, incredibly gentle on human cells, and specific in its attack, this was the breakthrough.
He recognized its medical potential immediately, unlike lysozyme, but he ran into a wall, and that wall was chemistry.
So penicillin had the biological power, but his early history just mirrors the rejection of his OWI work and the dismissal of lysozyme. The reception from the scientific community was, what, ice cold?
Completely. He presented his findings to the Medical Research Club in 1929, but the title itself, A Medium for the Isolation of Pfeiffer's Bacillus, clearly buried the lead on the mold juice.
Not exactly a blockbuster title.
Not at all. And the sources confirm this crushing lack of interest. Henry Dale, who was the chair of the meeting, a very respected figure, he later confessed he didn't sense any striking point of importance.
And his 1929 publication in the British Journal of Experimental Pathology also just went largely unnoticed.
The crucial problem, as you said, wasn't the biology. The effectiveness was clear. It was the chemistry. Fleming was an excellent bacteriologist, but he just didn't have the chemical expertise to turn this mold juice into a stable therapeutic compound.
But he faced two huge technical challenges, right?
Two interconnected, immense challenges. First, producing it in massive industrial quantities. That required sophisticated fermentation techniques he just didn't have.
And the second?
Chemical purification. The substance was incredibly labile.
Let's define labile here, because it's a critical concept for understanding why there was a decade-long delay.
Labile just means chemically unstable, easily destroyed. Early penicillin was notoriously unstable. If you left the culture broth out, the active compound would break down rapidly at room temperature.
And worse for trying to use it as a medicine, it was destroyed by stomach acid,
which made taking it orally impossible.
So if you try to purify it, it degrades. If you try to give it as a pill, it's destroyed before it even reaches the bloodstream. That's a profound technical barrier.
And Fleming tried. He collaborated with biochemists like Harold Raystrick, but they all struggled with the purification. Raystrick eventually concluded it was too unstable and too difficult to purify, and he basically gave up.
So the substance just languished, largely forgotten in the 1930s.
That's how one source put it. Fleming kept the mold alive. He published on methods to assess its effectiveness, but the sheer chemical impossibility just prevented any mass application.
The depth of his disappointment must have been immense. At the Second International Congress of Microbiology in 1936, Fleming spoke about penicillin's medical importance.
And V.D. Allison noted that no one believed him. The discussion was minimal. It was almost universally seen as just a laboratory curiosity, useful for differentiating bacteria in a dish, but not for treating patients.
But he never truly gave up on it.
His notebooks show he kept trying, experimenting with different media to improve production as late as 1939. But the chemical puzzle was just too big for a single bacteriology lab.
And that's why the focus finally shifts in 1938 to Oxford and to the collaboration that would change everything.
This is where Howard Florey, the pathologist, and Ernst Chain, the brilliant biochemist, enter the story at the Sir William Dunn School of Pathology.
Chain was interested in naturally occurring antibacterial substances, and he decided to revisit Fleming's decade-old paper.
Chain was the real driving force behind the isolation and purification. He was an intense, skeptical chemist. And there's that fantastic anecdote when Fleming decided to visit the Oxford team after they published their first promising results in 1940.
What did Chain say?
Upon hearing of the impending visit, he famously remarked, "Good God, I thought he was dead."
Wow. That really encapsulates just how forgotten Fleming's work had become.
It does. The Oxford team, they were backed by strong resources, and they had a completely different approach. Their success was a triumph of teamwork and applied chemistry. They were the ones who turned Fleming's concept into a clinical reality.
And what were the specific technical breakthroughs?
A few key ones. Edward Abraham proposed the correct but highly unstable molecular structure, a cyclic formation known as the Wallach-Damm ring. This structure is the business end of penicillin, but it's incredibly volatile, which explains the lability Fleming saw.
But the real breakthrough for making it stable came from Norman Heatley. He's often the unsung hero.
Absolutely. Heatley devised a simple but revolutionary technique. He suggested transferring the active ingredient from the acidic solvent they were using back into water just by changing the acidity or the pH.
That simple pH trick transformed the process.
It did. It allowed them to extract and stabilize the active ingredient, and it yielded this yellow, stable powder. By mid-1942, they had produced the first stable, pure penicillin compound. Heatley's technique was so vital, he later became famous for the Heatley unit, a standardized measure of penicillin potency.
So the discovery suddenly had a practical physical form. Now, let's go back to the clinical evidence, because even Fleming's earliest attempts foreshadowed both the drug's potential and its limitations.
Fleming's very first clinical trial in 1929 was, ironically, a complete failure.
Who did he treat?
He treated his research scholar, Stuart Craddock, who had severe sinusitis. The treatment failed because Craddock's infection was caused by Haemophilus influenza, a gram-negative bacterium that Fleming already knew was unsusceptible to penicillin.
So that early failure probably contributed to the decade of skepticism.
It may have, but the first successful clinical use actually belongs to Cecil George Payne, a pathologist in Sheffield who was one of Fleming's former students.
Oh, what did he do?
In 1930, Payne used the raw mold broth to successfully cure serious eye infections conjunctivitis in 1 adult and 3 infants with neonatal conjunctivitis. These were small-scale, topical, but they were successful.
But the real global turning point, the moment the public and the government really took notice, was the case of Harry Lambert in August 1942.
Lambert was an associate of Fleming's brother. He was admitted to St. Mary's with life-threatening streptococcal meningitis. Fleming first used sulfonamides, the chemical miracle drugs of the 30s, but Lambert was rapidly deteriorating.
He was dying.
He was. So Fleming, knowing this, desperately requested the isolated, purified sample from Florey's lab in Oxford, which had only just been stabilized. He confirmed the bacteria were susceptible and then administered the purified sample directly into Lambert's spinal canal.
Bypassing the blood-brain barrier.
Exactly. And the results were nothing short of miraculous. Lambert showed improvement the very next day and was completely recovered within a week.
That was the moment. The moment the laboratory curiosity became a systemic, life-saving drug.
And Fleming published this astounding clinical case in The Lancet in 1943. That case, happening in the middle of a war, convinced the British Ministry of Health.
The Penicillin Committee was formed in 1943, with Florey, Chain, and Fleming leading the charge for mass production.
And because Britain was under constant threat of bombing, the mass production efforts were strategically moved to a collaboration with American companies.
And the scale-up was just transformative. The drug was reserved exclusively for Allied forces.
The logistics were so successful that by D-Day in 1944, enough penicillin had been produced to treat every single wounded Allied soldier. It fundamentally changed the definition of a survivable war wound.
So this collective success was acknowledged globally. Fleming, Howard Florey, and Ernst Chain jointly received the 1945 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine.
And Fleming had been knighted the year before.
So what does all this mean for the public perception? The massive media coverage of these life-saving successes, especially the Harry Lambert case, it cemented this huge public profile for Fleming.
And it created what he himself called the Fleming myth.
But why did that happen? Why did he get all the credit?
The creation of the myth was really an artifact of professional ethics during wartime. Florey, a very private academic, strictly prohibited his Oxford team from seeking media coverage. He was afraid of being seen as self-promotional, especially with patients' lives on the line.
So as a result, only Fleming, who was already a figure in London society, was widely quoted and photographed.
And the public and the press just concluded he was solely responsible for the entire thing, from discovery all the way to drug development. Fleming felt this was profoundly unjust to his collaborators.
He was consistently modest about it, right?
Very. He routinely praised Florey and Chain, acknowledging that they were the ones who transformed his laboratory curiosity into a practical drug. His humility was genuine.
This collaborative, multidisciplinary complexity, it's captured in a famous quote from Henry Harris in 1998, which I think just perfectly sums it all up.
What's the quote?
Without Fleming, no Chain. Without Chain, no Florey. Without Florey, no Heatley. Without Heatley, no penicillin.
That's perfect. It shows it required the dreamer, the chemist, the pharmacologist, and the technician to complete the revolution.
Before we move on to his final warning, we really have to address the most persistent piece of fictional history about Fleming.
The Churchill fable.
Yes. This popular, widespread story claims Fleming's father saved a young Winston Churchill from drowning, and then in gratitude, Churchill's father paid for Alexander Fleming's entire education.
Total fiction. Our sources confirm it's a wondrous fable. Fleming himself denied it repeatedly, including in a 1945 letter to a colleague. His education was paid for by his older brother, and that inheritance from his uncle.
And there's a second version of the fable, a more recent one, that Fleming himself saved Churchill during the war.
Also false. Churchill did get pneumonia in Carthage in Tunisia in 1943. His physician, Lord Moran, treated him successfully not with penicillin, but with the sulfonamide drug sulfapyridine, often known by its research code M&B 693.
Churchill called it this admirable M&B. It's amazing how much harder a good story sticks than the mundane historical facts.
It truly is. But moving away from these fables, we arrive at what is arguably Fleming's single most important and tragically ignored contribution to modern medicine.
His early, chilling, and spot-on warning about antibiotic resistance.
This needs deep focus. Fleming discovered the mechanism of resistance very early on, during his initial experiments in the 1930s.
How did he figure it out?
He observed that if you exposed bacteria to concentrations of penicillin that were too low, or if the exposure time was too short, the bacteria wouldn't die. Instead, they would adapt. They developed the ability to survive future encounters with the drug.
And this had been demonstrated in S. aureus as early as 1942.
Yes. This observation turned him into a prophet. He spent the rest of his life, especially after winning the Nobel Prize, campaigning for the responsible use of his discovery. He understood the stakes almost immediately.
On June 26, 1945, just weeks after the end of the war in Europe, he delivered what is maybe the most crucial quote of his entire career.
He warned that the thoughtless person playing with penicillin is morally responsible for the death of the man who finally succumbs to infection with the penicillin-resistant organism. I hope this evil can be averted.
Just think about the weight of that statement. Morally responsible. He's assigning this deep ethical culpability to misuse before the drug was even globally available. He saw the future perfectly.
He was warning against exactly what happened in the 1950s and 60s when antibiotics became cheap and widely accessible.
He elaborated on this in his Nobel lecture in December 1945, didn't he?
He did. He predicted that the time may come when penicillin can be bought by anyone in the shops. Then there is the danger that the ignorant man may easily underdose himself, and by exposing his microbes to non-lethal quantities of the drug, make them resistant.
That is precisely what we call antimicrobial stewardship today. The careful management of antibiotics to prevent resistance. He articulated the concept of selective pressure and evolution in bacteria decades before it became a crisis.
He was warning against using too little or stopping your treatment too soon or using it for a condition where it wasn't even necessary.
And that warning is his lasting legacy. He didn't just give us the cure, he gave us the instruction manual for how not to lose it.
And the fact that the first penicillin-resistant strains of S. aureus emerged so soon after the drug's mass introduction, it just validates the devastating accuracy of his early observations. It underscores the foundational power of his critical thinking. He could anticipate the evolutionary response of the microbes themselves.
The trajectory of Alexander Fleming's career is one defined not by simple luck, but by this extraordinary ability to observe anomalies and to fiercely question authority.
He was a scientist who saw the failure of established practice in World War I, who discovered the world's first antimicrobial protein in his own tears.
And finally, stumbled upon the mold that truly changed history.
His legacy is immense. He was listed in Time magazine's 100 most important people of the 20th century. He transformed medicine, warfare, agriculture.
And for a unique detail of that impact, you just have to look at the statue of him that stands outside the main bull ring in Madrid, the Plaza de Toros de las Ventas.
I love that detail.
It was erected by grateful matadors because penicillin dramatically reduced the number of deaths from septic wounds that were a common fatal risk in the bull ring.
It's a testament to how his work permeated every corner of human life. He left us with a really complex narrative. A genius of observation, a scientist who preferred evidence over the establishment, and a reluctant public figure who had the humility to hand the chemical heavy lifting over to others.
He truly ushered in the age of useful antibiotics.
He did.
But the true shadow he cast was his warning. Fleming was not only the discoverer, but the very first person to articulate the looming global threat of drug resistance. So if he made that observation and articulated that chilling quote about the thoughtless person being morally responsible just 2 months after the greatest conflict in human history ended, decades before we faced a true global superbug crisis.
What does that tell us about the foundational necessity of critical observation in science, and why that caution, given its immediacy and clarity, is more relevant now than ever before? It forces us to ask whether we have truly honored the instruction manual provided by the man who gave us the greatest victory over disease.